Good afternoon. On behalf of the director of the Ramón Areces Foundation, Mr. Raimundo Pérez Hernández, let me give you a warm welcome to this foundation and to this conference. Let me introduce myself. My name is Daniel Santín. I'm professor of economics at the Complutense University of Madrid, and I'm also in charge of coordinating part of the activities that are organized or sponsored by the foundation. Today's conference is entitled Gender in Labor Markets of the 21st Century, and will be given by Barbara Petrongolo, who is professor at the University of Oxford. And in addition, Jan Stuller, professor at the Universidad Carlos III and COSME president, will introduce Professor Petrongolo and the issue of the conference and will moderate the questions from the audience after the talk. Thank you very much to both of you for having accepted to be here with us in Madrid in person for this talk. This event will be in English. However, since one of the priorities of the Foundation is to foster the use of the Spanish language in science, let me do part of these welcome words in Spanish. Bien, en primer lugar, quiero agradecerles a todos.
First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for having come to the headquarters of the Ramón Areces Foundation to enjoy this conference, because without you, it wouldn't make any sense. Today's conference has been organized in collaboration with the Committee of the Spanish Association of Economics on the situation of women in the economy, for its acronym COSME. And for that, I would like to thank all the people responsible for it, for their coordination work of the 17th Gender Economic Workshops, which is being held today and tomorrow in the facilities of the Foundation, as well as for today's conference. And thank you so much, Mr. Jan Stewart, the chairman. And thirdly, for those of you who are not familiarized with the objectives of the Ramón Areces Foundation, let me tell you that the foundation has as an objective to promote the carrying out of excellent science in Spain. And for that, the Ramón Areces Foundation, in its three areas, social sciences, matter sciences, and humanities, organizes many activities, amongst which I would like to point to the four main programs of scholarships and aid, the postgraduate scholarships abroad for the best Spanish students so that they can do their master's and PhD degrees abroad. The also program of post-PhD help, and also programs for people under 40 years of age. The Ramón Areces Foundation also has established many strategic alliances with some of the most important research centers in the world, including the London School of Economics, MIT, or the Oxford University. And finally, the foundation carries out activities like this one, where we try to talk about the outcomes of excellent science, but we don't want it to stay only in academic papers. And we put it in touch with civil society so that it can be informed with the best information available. For those interested in our activities, look at the webpage of the foundation and the YouTube channel, where you will find much more content and conferences of top-notch quality, as the conference we're going to hear today. Once again, thank you everyone for being here. And without any further ado, why don't we enjoy this conference? So, Jan, the floor is yours.
Bienvenido.
Welcome. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this introduction of Barbara Petrongolo. She's going to speak in English, which I love, because it means that I can also speak in English, and you won't have to suffer my Spanish.
Much easier. And so I think Daniel already explained what kind of position she has, and this was part of what I wanted to say. So I'm going to say it again, just in case you forgot one of these positions, and we have a gap in how we introduce Barbara. So she's professor of economics at the University of Oxford. She's a professorial fellow at the Nuffield College. And I think this one sounds actually the most interesting, fellow of the British Academy. And so for those of you who don't know what that is, that means being a very distinguished economist to be invited to be a fellow on this list. And she's also a research associate at the CEP in London, so at the London School of Economics. So for those of you who go through London, you might also see Barbara walking around in London, and not only in Oxford. You were previously at other universities, Queen Mary University of London, London School of Economics, Paris School of Economics, and of course the most important one in this list, which was Universidad Carlos III de Madrid. So you're a former member of our department, and yeah, we are sorry that we lost you to the UK, but of course to a very good career. So briefly on what Barbara is working on. So Barbara is one of these economists who shows up in many different contexts, right? And if you do labor economists, you're going to see her work in not just in gender. So today, of course, we are here to talk about gender. Barbara's presentation is going to be about gender, gender in the labor market, and also this workshop of which this presentation is part of is about gender, right? So I'm standing here because this year I'm president of COSME, which is the Committee for the Situation of Women in Economics. And so we do different things, but one of the main things we do is this workshop about gender and economics. And so we had a set of, for those of you who haven't been in this academic part, we had a set of seminars, and sort of this is now our sort of first highlight of the day, main highlight of the day to have this keynote. But Barbara is not just working on gender, she's working on other topics and has made important contributions. So for example, she has worked on search and matching, and so how labor markets function, how jobs and workers find each other. She has worked on dual labor markets. For example, I saw one of your best cited papers is with Maya Guay, who should be somewhere here in the audience. Yeah, she's waving over there. So that's on dual labor markets, on transitory, temporary and permanent positions. So on topics that are very important also for Spain, for the Spanish economy. And you, for example, worked with Alan Manning on local labor markets, which is the type of work that many of us will have seen as well. Okay, so I don't want to talk much longer. So we are very happy to have you here. We are very honored to have you here. And we are looking forward to your talk about inequality and gender in the labor market in the 21st century. Yeah. Welcome, Barbara. Yeah.
So thank you very much for this very nice introduction, Jan, and thank you for inviting me here. So I'm going to be talking about recent work that I've done on the evolution of gender inequalities in the labor market. Much of what I'm going to say today is based on joint work with my co-authors, Claudia Olivetti at Dartmouth and Jessica Pana, Singapore. So I'm going to speak in English as Jan has just introduced me. I'm very happy to hear your questions. Feel free to ask questions in English or Spanish as you like. I don't mind at all. Okay, so let me just introduce this topic. Perhaps all of you are familiar with women's increased involvement in the economy over the past century or so. Perhaps one can probably say that women's increased involvement in the labor market was one of the main social changes that we witnessed in the past 100 years or so. And this kind of change entered any aspect of sort of economic life, but not only. So women made major inroads in the education system, in employment and wages, and even in leadership roles. And this is very important because this kind of convergence in gender trends has happened against the backdrop of rising inequalities along virtually any other kind of dimension. So after decades of increasing inequality by education, by occupation, by social status, we have seen, for example, this increase in inequality fueling populist politics and populist anger. Well, in all of that, the narrowing of gender gaps in the labor market provide a very good news on what's going on about labor market inclusion. But nevertheless, despite this kind of success, there are important hurdles on the path towards gender inequality in all countries in the world. And then, of course, different countries differ according to the kind of gender inequalities that are mostly prevailing. So today, I'm going to be talking almost exclusively about high-income countries. So just to make a very brief summary, women still make educational choices that are systematically different from the choices of men. So typically they made educational choices that are less conducive to high-earning careers. There are large and persistent gender gaps in both employment and wages. And also gender gaps in paid work are more than offset, more than compensated by women's disproportionate involvement in domestic work. And moreover, women bear the whole earnings penalty from parenthood. And today in the conference, we have seen several super interesting papers precisely on this point, on the disparate impact of fertility on men and women. And all this is kind of surprising if one steps back and looks at this kind of stylized past, because everything happened despite equalized education opportunities in all the countries that I'm going to talk about and equal pay legislation. So just to give you a flavor of the facts I was talking about, this concerns gender differences in the kind of fields that women and men specialize in university. So let me see if I can use this pointer. Okay, so basically here I am plotting the share of women graduating in STEM higher education against the share of men in a bunch of relatively middle to high income countries. All those countries, they are below the 45-degree lines. What it means that in all these countries, women are by far less likely to graduate from science, math, engineering, and technology than men. So in all these countries, the share of men graduating in STEM goes from more or less between 25% and 55%. For women, this number is everywhere lower than 25%. Let me move on to the labor market here. Now here, what I'm showing is the extent of gender gaps in earnings, again, in a large number of high-income countries. So you can see all these bars here. The height of the bars represents the gender gap in total earnings. And I want to argue here that perhaps looking at total earnings is one meaningful measure of gender gaps, because this takes into account the extent to which men and women are differently likely to participate to the labor market, then conditional on participating, they might be working different hours, and then conditional on a given number of hours, they might be earning different wages. So the height here represents the total gender gap in earnings, and you can see even in countries that we would believe to be relatively gender equal, for example, like Finland, the gender gap in earnings here is about 25%. And then this increases towards more or less 40% in the middle of the distribution. So for example, Spain here is around 38%, and then all the way up to almost 80% in Japan and Korea as well. Okay, so this is the total earnings gap. So this is a huge number. So Finland, we're talking about 25%. Now the three colors, green, red, and blue, represent the components. So the blue colors represent the extent to which men and women are differently likely to be employed. The red component is the difference in hours, and the green component is the difference in wages. And basically, without going into too much detail, you can see that all three margins matter in all countries. So for example, if again you look at Spain here, they almost matter equally. 1/3 is differences in participation, 1/3 is differences in hours, 1/3 is differences in wages. Now, what I've shown you before was just about the labor market. And now I'm showing you, as in a mirror, what happens in the labor market, which is the yellow bars, against what happens in the household, and that is the green bars. So the yellow bars here represent the gender gap in unpaid work in the household. And this is measured as the hours of men minus the hours of women. Sorry, the yellow gap is, the yellow bars is the gap in the labor market. The hours of men minus the hours of women, and they're positive everywhere. So the gap is very large, for example, in Turkey, Portugal, Mexico, at the top of the distribution, much smaller in Scandinavia, at the bottom of the distribution. On the other side, on the negative side, the green bars represent the extent to which women work more in the household than men. So this is the gap in unpaid work. As you can see, this is everywhere negative. Everywhere in these countries, women work more in the household than men. But something that is kind of more interesting and more important is that the gaps in unpaid work, in absolute value, are actually much bigger than the gaps in paid work. So this means that overall, women enjoy less leisure. They're working a lot more in the household relative to how much less they're working in the market, so they have less leisure time. So what does that mean? Having less leisure time means basically having less rest, less enjoyment, less fun stuff to do. But it also means that this disproportionate involvement in unpaid work is, of course, less conducive to social status, to bargaining power within the household, etc. So let me just zoom in on Spain. This is just about Spain. And as you can see, it's very similar to the sort of average case of the previous slide. So there is a gap in paid work per day of about 1 hour. Men work 1 hour more than women in the market. In terms of unpaid work, the gap is basically 2.4 hours, so nearly 2.5 hours women do more work in the household than men, which means that every day women spend less than 1 hour, more than 1 hour less than men just enjoying leisure. So imagine giving up 1 hour of your leisure every day. Okay, as I said before, I was only talking about rich countries, and then I have one slide on the rest of the world. So when I was talking about rich countries, I was talking about gender differences in employment, gender differences in hours, gender differences in wages, leadership position, STEM specialization. If we look at the whole world, the kind of inequalities I was talking about are literally dwarfed by the gender inequalities that happen everywhere else. So basically, this is a world map, and then the intensity of the color here represents the intensity of gender inequalities across a very wide number of dimensions. So this kind of gender inequalities take into account free access or lack of free access to education, to health, to political rights, to physical integrity, on top, of course, of labor market earnings. So you can see that there is this whole area of the poor world, sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia, in which inequalities are so much larger than anyone else. So again, I will focus on rich countries, on the sort of light blue areas, but let's not forget that gender inequalities have different size and shape in the rest of the world. Okay. So just to convince you that gender convergence is far from complete, as I said before, there's inequalities in wages, employment, the cost of fertility. And so there's basically two questions that we should be sort of addressing in the research. First of all, why have gender gaps not closed? And secondly, is this a problem, and why is this a problem at all? And perhaps I should argue we need to answer those questions in this order, because whether or not we are talking about a problem in terms of social issues, it really depends on what is the root cause of those gender gaps and why they have not closed. So here is just a little bit of curiosity on the academic literature. As I was saying before, in the past 5 decades or so, there has been enormous progress of women in the labor market, and this progress of women has been accompanied hand in hand by progress in the literature. So in here, these pink and red bars represent the share of papers in economics that were published in top 30 journals that have some gender-related word in the title. So either a restrictive definition, female, women, gender, or a more sort of comprehensive definition, including wife, maternity, mother, and girls. Regardless of the definition, you can see that there is a steady increase in the interest in our profession on gender. So basically, the share of gender paper doubled in 50 years. And one might say, well, perhaps there was a lot more interest in inequality as a whole, which is of course true. But for example, if we look at inequality by ethnic groups, race-related papers, they're completely stable. So if anything, there is something really special about this gender literature, which is actually exploding in recent decades. Okay, so just to try to summarize what this literature has found, I'm going to talk about the separate roles of preferences and constraints in the labor market, as far as these two things can be separately identified. Then I'm going to talk about the career cost of children, and this is very strongly related to the first point. Once we acknowledge that men and women may face different constraints in the labor market, we have to be clear that a lot of those differential constraints, they all boil down to children. It's all about children, or it's mostly about children. And then the third point is again related to the second, because why is this mostly about children? Because there is a role played by gender norms and gender stereotypes that we need to sort of understand. Okay, so with this kind of roadmap in mind, let me start about this kind of distinction between preferences and constraints. So there are these two fundamentally different explanations for gender gaps. One explanation is that there are essential differences between men and women, and these differences may concern their preferences, what women and men like to do, how they like to spend their time, differences in skills, differences in psychological traits, and those differences would be reflected in the inequality that we observe in education, the labor market, and gender roles. So basically, gender inequality is a manifestation of those underlying differences. The other story is that perhaps men and women are fairly similar in many relevant dimensions, but they face different opportunities and constraints. What are these different opportunities and constraints? Well, family responsibilities might weigh in different ways on men and women, and this might be sort of filtered through social norms, stereotypes, discrimination. So whenever we talk about differential opportunities, differential access to labor market careers, then we really need to think as gender inequality as a symptom of misallocation. Now here I'm making things perhaps a little bit too simple, as if these two stories were completely separate. Now in reality, of course, there's lots of challenges behind that classification, because one may think of cases in which observed gender differences in behavior, for example, in attitudes or traits, are a manifestation, for example, of pre-labor market discrimination, are a manifestation of what we learned in our families, what we learned in the education system. So of course, it's very hard in many cases to separate these two stories. So let me give you some evidence on both. Let me start from gender differences in traits. So we can immediately think of a number of individual characteristics like attitudes and behavior that might be more or less conducive to labor market success. For example, let's think about risk-taking behavior, competitive behavior, self-confidence, social preferences. We may think of cases in which these kind of characteristics may help or may provide a sort of detriment to our own labor market involvement. So for example, one can think of high earnings career they develop in very uncertain competitive environment, and if somebody is especially risk averse, they might basically trade off this kind of preference for a safe job for a very highly rewarding career. Now, this is a sort of intuitive explanation, except if we look at the data, the meta-analysis that have looked at differences in these characteristics have shown that these differences only explain a modest proportion of the gender gaps that we observe in the labor market. So these are the results of a study that I did a few years ago with a team of co-authors at the LSE, and we wanted to measure how the economics profession have learned and have understood these gender differences in a trait that is extremely important in the labor market, which is self-confidence. Of course, self-confidence is very important to be successful. So what we did, we constructed a survey which we sent to all affiliate members to the CPR. So the CPR is the main European network of economists in any field. So probably some of you were in my sample a few years back. So what we asked everybody was this kind of simple question. What do you think you have learned from the literature that tests for gender differences in self-confidence? So we were not asking, do you think that men and women have different self-confidence? We asked, what has this literature found? Okay? So here there is a very small proportion of people, about 7-8%, that says, we've learned that both men and women are overconfident. Then there is a huge share, 10 times as high, 75% of people, who say actually men are overconfident and women are underconfident. And then there is a very small share of everything else. But basically, 3/4 of distinguished economists think that this literature has established that women are underconfident and men are overconfident. And then what we did in this paper, we looked at the papers. So we actually took the empirical results with their sort of confidence intervals on all the papers that were estimating gender differences in overconfidence. And this is what the results are telling. So actually, the huge majority of papers, like nearly 70% of paper, is finding that both men and women are overconfident. So there's no such a thing as underconfident women. So this is the vast majority of results. And it's only a minority of results, let's say less than 20%, that actually finds that, as we believe, we as economics profession, that men are overconfident and women are underconfident. So there is a vast misperception in this population. And then one may think, well, okay, but this population includes people who specialize in economic theory or in finance or in industrial organization. They don't need to know this literature. So let's just focus on labor economics, public economics, development economics. We are all the same. If we distinguish like female respondent and male respondent, we are all exactly the same. So basically, I don't know if you remember, but if you've ever heard about this book, there was this book published in the 1990s, Women Are for Venus and Men Are from Mars, something like that. Here, everybody's from Mars. Everybody's overconfident and delusional. So how overconfident are men and women? Perhaps men are more overconfident than women. And this is the difference. So this is the overconfidence of men, and this is the overconfidence of women. And these are two very, very tight confidence intervals, which we derive by aggregating all the results that exist in the data. So you may say, well, perhaps there is a little bit of overconfidence higher for men than for women. Now, there are other, more meaningful ways of aggregating this data, considering that perhaps different papers identify different concepts, because one paper may focus on Chinese students on a university campus versus young adults in Germany making investment decisions. So there is perhaps some additional sort of noise in the data that if we take that into account, you can see that those levels of overconfidence are almost exactly the same. So there isn't such a thing as underconfident women on average, so it doesn't really seem that we can explain a lot by looking at gender differences in overconfidence. Now, there is another hypothesis that has come up in this literature that I find super interesting, the so-called gender similarity hypothesis, which was put together by social psychologists, actually, much more than economists. They did a lot more than economists, and actually before economists started to look at this stuff. And the main conclusion of this literature is that the difference between the average man and the average woman in many characteristics that we care about is actually a lot smaller than the difference, than the variation that we can observe within each gender. So there is this very famous study by this social psychologist, Hyde. She puts together studies on more than 120 traits. So 120 traits include lots of measures of academic ability, for example, maths ability, verbal reasoning, etc. Lots of stuff about psychological trait, risk-taking, altruistic behavior, stuff about moral reasoning. So imagine 120 characteristics. Now, for more than 3/4 of these characteristics, there is a large enough overlap in the distribution of male and female trait to say, actually, men and women are very similar to one another average. It's mostly that within a gender, there is really a lot of variation. So for example, for traits like self-esteem, maths, verbal skill, gregariousness and conscientiousness, leadership, academic self-concept, all stuff that is super important, this is what the distributions from females and males would look like if we make the assumption that the distribution is normal. So there is a huge overlap, and then, well, perhaps if we want to look here at the difference in the means, there is a tiny, tiny difference, but this is completely dwarfed by the variation within a gender. So if we want to explain gender gaps in the labor market by simply looking at gender differences in, say, overconfidence, perhaps you're not looking in the right place. Okay. Now, of course, there are clear exceptions in some domains. So I was saying this person, Hyde, is using 124 traits, and only for 3/4, men and women are fairly similar. But for 1/4, they're not similar. Actually, they're systematically different. What are these traits? For example, motor skills. Physical skills are different between men and women. So men can run faster, men can throw objects, more heavier objects further away, etc. In some measures of sexuality, but not all measures of sexuality, men and women tend to be different. And in physical aggression, they also tend to be different. Now, if you think about labor market success, you may think that this stuff like motor skills, sexuality, physical aggression is not that valuable, perhaps, in the labor market. So we may think, okay, then we should be fine. Actually, let's think again. There is a lot that has become known recently, most notably since the Me Too movement of 2018, about the consequences of workplace sexual harassment. So this is one case in which differential behavior of women and men in terms of, for example, of violence and sexual harassment actually has asymmetric consequences on the careers of men and women. And to summarize this, I'm showing you here the results by a colleague of mine in Oxford and her co-authors. So what this picture is showing is what happens in Finland when there are incidents of workplace violence. So basically, they have all police reports in Finland. Some of these reports refer to incidents of workplace violence. So violence between colleagues, people who work in the same plant. And then they classify this violence in male on women, so male perpetrator, female victim, and then male on male, male perpetrator, male victim. And these bars here represent the probability that the victim and the perpetrator remain employed at that firm after the incident. So imagine that two colleagues of yours, one is hitting the other, one is having like a violent episode against the other, who is going to lose their jobs? Okay? So when it's male on female, they're both likely to lose their jobs than otherwise, than in the case in which the violence never happened. But here, the victim is more likely to lose her job than the perpetrator. So the cost of workplace violence are higher for the victim whenever the victim is a woman. And when it's man on man, actually, again, both are likely to leave the workplace, but the victim is less likely to leave the workplace than the perpetrator. So this is a case in which those gender differences in traits have asymmetric consequences vis-a-vis constraints in the labor market. Okay, now let's go back to this case in which perhaps gender differences in traits are not that large and we want to focus on constraints. Okay, so talking about constraints, barriers, and their consequences, this is really the area in which there have been major advances in economists' understanding of gender gaps. So the key reason why we thought this was important is because differential gender opportunities and barriers naturally lead to question to allocative efficiency. So allocative efficiency requires that people do the jobs that maximizes the returns to their skill. If for certain jobs we mostly sample from one pool, we predominantly sample from one pool, it means that the talent of the other pool is not used in the best possible way. So understanding this point has opened a new perspective on inequalities beyond this kind of zero-sum fallacy whereby reducing inequalities between men and women means sort of redistributing resources from men to women. This is a case in which, in principle, anybody could be a winner. And we've learned a lot more, for example, recently from this paper here in Econometrica. So what this paper is measuring is what was happening in the US over the past 60 years, thanks to the reduced barriers that ethnic minorities were facing when entering high-level education, and the reduction in barriers that women were facing when entering high-earnings occupation. So we say, okay, we start in the 1960s with the highly segregated societies. There are barriers to minorities. These barriers are mostly in the shape of barriers to educational entry for the African American population and barriers to labor market entry for women. And then measuring those barriers over time, how they have evolved, of course they have reduced for both minorities. And what this could explain is between 20% and 40% of higher GDP per head growth in the US. So a large chunk of GDP per head growth in the US was explained by the reduction in barriers for the entry of minorities in education and labor market. And here there is a paper that looks at that achieves very similar result, taking data from a sort of internal labor market, from a multinational with branches around the world. So this really says that whenever women face constraints in the labor market, opening the door to more women implies an improvement in total productivity, for example. But this is not just about women, this is about men as well, because when we think about the labor market, there are some professions that are male-dominated, but there's also professions that are heavily female-dominated. So if there are barriers to male entry into those female-dominated occupations, it means that we are not using male talent in the best possible way. And there are two very interesting studies that show precisely that. One study here refers to the UK social care sector. Social care sector in the UK, as in most of the countries, is super female-dominated, 80% women. And an experiment in social care that tweaked adverts, so job adverts, by inducing more men to apply to this position, improved the selection of male applicants and improved the selection of male talent into this profession. So basically, the marginal man entering social care was better than the marginal woman that this man was displacing. And similarly, a very interesting natural experiment for the education sector in Finland. So in Finland, up until 1980, there was a gender quota in education, a gender quota in favor of men. So there was a minimum 40% quota to the representation of men in the public education sector. This quota was lifted in 1980, and what happened over time is that, of course, the sector became more female-intensive. A lot more women were entering the sector relative to men, because men used to be the protected category, but not anymore. So what happened to test scores down the line? Actually, the gender quota achieved a better quality of teaching overall, better test scores, than the decentralized sort of spontaneous selection system, because apparently the selection system was penalizing some very valuable traits that those marginal men entering thanks to the quota were having, and basically these men were displacing women who didn't have those traits. So this is really to try to think about this selection of talent in a symmetric way. So what is the nature of these differential constraints, differential gender opportunities in the labor market? So this basically all boils down to recognizing the differential involvement of men and women in the care for children. So basically, human capital gaps have completely closed in terms of years of schooling. In many cases, they have reversed. Outright discrimination on the job probably has almost disappeared, so it's all about children. And this is where this literature has virtually exploded in the past decade or so. So there have been several approaches to estimating the career cost of children for men and women, but despite different approaches, different strengths, different weaknesses, all these approaches tend to agree on a consensus that childbirth is detrimental to female careers to varying extent, and it's almost a non-event for male careers. So there are various approaches. I will be very brief on these methodologies, but just to give you a flavor of what people are estimating, there are some estimates of dynamic life cycle models of educational choices on fertility. So this is basically taking into account people's decision about education, occupation, marital status, fertility, labor supply. So this is a way to estimate those mechanisms simultaneously. There are IV approaches, so approaches that focus on particular sources, particular cases of variation of fertility. So very recently, there are papers that look at couples that go for fertility treatment for IVF. So all these couples want to have children. Some couples are lucky because they manage to conceive through IVF. Some couples are unlucky, they don't manage to conceive. So this approach compares the sort of lucky and unlucky couples. And then there are event study approaches, which are an extremely successful and very kind of intuitive approach that is basically comparing what happens before and after birth for people of the same gender, the same age, who have children at different ages. Again, all these kind of methodologies have different strengths, different weaknesses, but they tend to agree that childbirth is roughly neutral for men and generates a sharp, persistent, and large setback in female earnings. So this is event study estimates for Denmark. I guess many of you are familiar with this kind of graph. So the gray line represents the earnings of men around their first birth. As you can see, those earnings, once they are detrended by life cycle effects, they're completely flat. Birth is a non-event for Danish fathers, while instead birth represents a decrease of about 25% in the earnings of mothers, not just after birth, but even 10 years after birth. And this is very important in a sort of more historical perspective, because if you look back in 1980, gender inequality in Denmark was huge. There was a 45% gap in the earnings of men and women, and this gap is explained in roughly equal proportion by child-related inequality in blue, education-related inequality in orange, and residual inequality, also related to discrimination and unexplained variation in gray. Fast forward for 35 years, as you can see, education-related inequality is almost gone, residual inequality is almost gone, it's all about children. And this is true in many other countries, okay? So for example, this refers to Spain, and there is a very interesting paper that looks at this kind of child penalties around the whole world. Okay, so what explains that? What drives the child penalties? What's the anatomy of the child penalties? Typically, when we say child penalty, we mean the difference in earnings between mothers and fathers that can be entirely explained by the presence of children. So what part of the inequality between a mother and a father can be driven by the child? Now, we tend to say that birth is sort of non-event for fathers, but in some circumstances, not only mothers lose after childbirth, there is actually a fatherhood premium. So men who become fathers, they tend to earn more. And there is some suggesting evidence that this is coming through higher specialization in the household. After the first child, many women don't simply look after the child, they also take care of much other stuff in the household. They're home when the engineer comes to fix the washing machine. So basically, the man can work more in the labor market. There might actually be a fatherhood premium. Also, something that is kind of interesting is that, again, if we want to know about the anatomy of those child penalties, what is actually driving that, we show in my recent work with my colleagues in Oxford that a large chunk of the penalty is really driven by incapacitation effect. There is long parental leave in many countries. During parental leave, you're not working. You're attached to the labor market, but you're not working. So, for example, this is the penalty that you would observe in Denmark, taking into account that people here are on parental leave. And then again, they might be on parental leave 2 years later, 3 years later, 4 years later, if they have more children. If we take that aside by just focusing on when people are in the labor market, what are their labor supply choices in the labor market, you can see that the child penalty is a lot smaller. But still, it's fairly large. It's nearly 20%, and it remains significant 5 years down the line. So what are the channels? We might think about biology, so we may back to gender differences in characteristics. Women give birth, women breastfeed. So how much of that is explained by different biology? And here we have very interesting evidence from adoptive couples and same-sex couples. So for adoptive couples, there's no biology there. The mother didn't give birth, the father didn't give birth, there is just the gender roles, if any. So the evidence from adoptive couples shows that the child penalty is actually very similar to biological couples. So it doesn't seem that biology explains a lot. And then interestingly, if you look at same-sex female couples, in that case, there is the biological factor for the birth mother. There is no biological factor, of course, for the adoptive mother, but they're both women, so they're part of the same gender. And in this case, you do see the biological mother having a penalty in the very short run, but then converging to the adoptive mother a lot faster. So it seems that it's really something about gender, not so much about biology. So the most interesting channel that a lot of people are studying these days is really about labor supply adjustment. What is it that women and men do differently when women go back to the labor market after parental leave? So basically, the answer is very simple. New mothers take career breaks, they work fewer hours, and in doing that, they may slip down the occupational ladder. So it has been shown that once they become mothers, women have a relatively high willingness to pay, so a willingness to sort of give up some of their sort of potential earnings in order to work in jobs that have family-friendly amenities. What are these amenities? For example, work flexibilities, possibility to work from home, shorter commutes, shorter work weeks. And of course, when we talk about flexibility, we can think that not all flexibility cases are created equal. There are cases of good flexibility where I'm completely in charge of my work week, and cases of bad flexibility where it's my employer who decides on call when I have to show up for work. Now, what I'm going to show here is some descriptive evidence, just correlation, on what happens in those jobs that have introduced a lot more opportunities of working from home. So the data here, we borrow this data from a famous paper on working from home by Nick Bloom and co-authors. In that paper, what they do, they decode about 250 million adverts in English-speaking countries around the world before COVID and after COVID. So from all those adverts, with a machine learning tool, they extract information on whether the job allows you to work from home. So what we do here, we basically take adverts for the US and we group them into little cells that are defined by industry, occupation, and local area. So we have about 5,000 cells. Imagine that a cell is a kind of self-contained labor market, is one occupation, for example, shop assistants in industry retail in the area of Washington, DC. What is the correlation between the availability of working from home opportunities and the presence of women in that particular cell? So as you can see, the correlation here is upward sloping. This is kind of good news for working from home. In particular, jobs that saw a 10 percentage point increase in job adverts before and after COVID in the possibility of working from home experienced an increase in the female employment share of nearly 4 percentage points. So this seems to be relatively good news. But it's not so much good news if we look at wages. So if we ask the same question about within those cells, what happens to relative female earnings, if anything here the correlation is negative. So jobs that had an increase in working from home opportunity, if anything, had slower wage growth for women than for men, although things are very imprecise, it's not statistically significant, but there's clearly no good news for earnings. So it might mean, for example, that women have a preference for working from home, but they might be paying a higher penalty, maybe because high-paying jobs are not available when working from home, or maybe because working from home per se has an impact on your own promotion prospects. You might be forgotten at the workplace, you may be passed over for a promotion. There is a value attached to the physical presence at work because you may learn more. We don't know that, and this is really something that we need to study. Okay. Another thing that is kind of interesting, which also links to my other research on non-competitive labor markets, is that all these channels are going to be exacerbated in non-competitive labor markets. Non-competitive labor markets are those in which employers have some market power, which means in very simple terms that employers can pay workers below their productivity without immediately losing all the workers to the competition. Let's put it this way. So employers have some market power in lowering wages below productivity. And this kind of literature has some suggesting evidence, it's still some very, very early studies, very early results, has suggested some evidence that perhaps this mechanism of markdown of wages below productivity is more important for women than for men. And the reason is because, again, there are constraints to female job search, so perhaps when women look for jobs, they have higher constraints in terms of how far they're willing to commute, how long they're willing to work, what kind of working schedule they want to have, etc. So this restricts outside options for women. I'm going to give you here the results from a very interesting study for Brazil. So this study summarizes what happens in the textile sector in Brazil in 2005. So what happened in 2005, there was in place this international trade agreement about trading sort of textile products, multi-fiber agreement, which collapsed in 2005. So in Brazil, some of the firms in the textile sector were producing exactly those specific products that were subject to the regulation, and some others were not affected. So what this paper here is comparing what's happening to women and men in the sector that was affected by the collapse of the multi-trade agreement relative to the unaffected sector. So what happens to the wages? This is when the trade agreement collapses, the wages of women decline by about 5%, and they stay persistently lower by 5% 5 years after the shock. What happens to men? There is even a bigger decline initially, but then within 3 years, men go back exactly to the same wages that they had before the shock. So no permanent effects for men. So how come that women bear permanent effects and women don't? Precisely because they have different search behavior. They have different opportunities in the labor market. They have different behavior, different willingness to quit their current employer. So if you look at the probability that men and women remain at the current employer, for women, it only goes down a little bit, only like 3 years after the shock. For men, it goes down 3 times as much immediately just after the shock. So there is a much higher elasticity of labor supply to the employer for men than there is for women. Okay, so let me kind of wrap this up. And now moving on to why is it the case that fertility and all the constraints that come as a consequence of fertility have completely different impacts on men and women. Now, this is where this literature has become very successful, the literature on the role of gender norms. And the nice thing about gender norms is really they provide a sort of natural explanation as to why work-family issues remain largely a woman's problem, despite the economic advancement of women, not just in the labor market, but also in education. So basically, if we believe that there are some characteristics of jobs, for example, very long hours, very inflexible hours, traveling at the weekend, very long commutes, etc., all this stuff is probably family unfriendly. But there is no reason that it should be more unfriendly to women than to men unless gender roles are completely unequal in the household. So perhaps the reason why gender roles are unequal in the household is because we believe that things have to be that way. So we believe that there is some unwritten norm that a lot of us want to stick to. So this idea of norms has become really popular in economics after a very important study by Akerlof and Krantov in 2000. So this idea is that really the norms are part of your utility function. So if you believe that things have to be done in a certain way, you're willing to leave some money on the table, you're willing to sacrifice some part of your career in order to do things in that particular way. So there is really a growing literature that has tried to provide direct tests of the role of gender norms on labor market gaps. So you may think, how important are norms these days in rich countries? And I'm going to give you, so I don't know how many, maybe some of you were in the UK during the COVID-19 lockdown. So in the really tight lockdown period, of course, governments were trying to tell us to do our best not to spread the disease. So the UK government was telling us to stay home and save lives. That's the most important thing we had to do. But then they went further. They were trying to explain us how we should be staying home and saving lives. So 4 things. In the first sort of vignette, you see a family sitting on the sofa, so a kid, a woman, and a man relaxing on the sofa. So this is like family leisure. In the second vignette, you see a woman with a baby in her hands. Probably she's going to change their nappies. In the third vignette, there is this woman reading a book to a toddler and also taking care of a school-age child doing homeschooling. In the fourth vignette, there is this woman doing cleaning, home chores, and actually the sort of perverse thing is that she's going to be held by her teenage daughter, not by her teenage son. So there's also this kind of intergenerational transmission of really sexist norm, and this was the UK in 2020. So this kind of adverts survived very little online. Of course, there was a huge backlash about sexism, but this is basically the first thing that the UK government had in mind when thinking about staying home and saving lives. Okay, where do we get less anecdotal evidence, so more like fine-grained evidence? So there is plenty of evidence that gender norms affect women's trade-off between their marriage and their career. For example, there is evidence that families in which the wife out-earns the husband, they have more problems in terms of marital stability and marital success. Also, for example, among politicians, job promotion for politicians increase the likelihood of divorce when the woman is the promoted politician rather than when the man is the promoted politician. Also, women may actually avoid career-advancing actions when they perceive some kind of trade-off about how good they look in an MBA program that is very prestigious, how sort of competitive they look in this program, how good they would be as the perfect wife. Also, there is some evidence about willingness to pay for conformity. So this is my work on Sweden, showing that in Sweden, for example, immigrants, they tend to behave a lot more conservatively than natives when it comes, for example, to having women responding to labor market incentives, and in particular, tax cuts. Okay, now this figure here summarizes in a simple but super, super clear correlation what happens in different countries in terms of child penalties, so maternal penalties from motherhood, strictly speaking, how do they vary with how conservative norms are in these countries? So on the horizontal axis here, we are showing the share of people in the population of all these 6 countries who believe that children under school age or in school would suffer if their mothers work in the labor market. So this proportion is very low in Denmark, but still is like 20%, and very high in Germany, like 60%. Sorry, it's very low, it's on horizontal axis, sorry. Low in Germany, like 8%, high in Germany, low in Denmark, high in Germany, like 40%. And this is very strongly correlated to the kind of estimates I was showing before about the long-run child penalty in earnings. So the penalty is actually fairly low in Denmark and Sweden, which is relatively gender neutral, extremely high in German-speaking countries, which are very gender conservative. Okay, so where do the norms come from? It's very easy for economists to put something in a utility function and say, okay, this object that I put in a black box utility function is shaping my behavior. So what is the origin of that? Now, we really have limited understanding about what drives gender norms, so this is where the research is trying to go at the moment. And the key question here is, to what extent are gender norms intrinsic? So it's my intrinsic preference, it's my intrinsic belief, it's my intrinsic religion, and to what extent this is socially conditioned. I really care about what my neighbors will think about me, if I behave in line with the norm or not. So if indeed discrimination arises to prevailing stereotypes in society because I sort of fear public shame, then probably we may think of norms and discrimination as two sides of the same coin. So, for example, there are cases in which adults shape gender-appropriate behavior in children. Whenever parents treat children differently, they sort of socialize them differently, depending on whether they're boys or girls. There might be biases in education, the way in which primary school teachers sort of treat differently boys and girls when they expose boys and girls to mathematical problems. Now, there is evidence in both directions. There is evidence that gender norms have very, very old origins. So basically, this is stuff that we've sort of inherited through centuries of history. So for example, here, a very interesting paper is one that shows even in pre-industrial societies, so agricultural societies, cases of mechanization in agriculture were sort of female unfriendly because, for example, using a plow in the field required a lot of body strength. So using the plow was something that men could do while women could no longer do, so they retreated in the household looking for children. And this kind of gender specialization had impact that went further for centuries. But also there is evidence, which is probably more interesting and more optimistic, about the malleability of social norms. So it has been shown, for example, that technological progress and medical innovation do lead to an evolution of gender norms. For example, contraceptives, for example, home appliances. Political institutions like state socialism also shape gender norms. So for example, after German unification, despite the fact that East and West Germans were exposed to exactly the same institutions, they seem to have on average fairly different gender norms. Public policies here are very important. There is a very interesting paper on Spain by Lydia Ferrer and co-author that has shown that when paternity leave was introduced in Spain, starting in 2007, men were more involved, of course, in baby care. They also were more involved in childcare when those kids were going to primary school. And now that these kids are 17, they have been interviewed in public schools in Spain. And the kids who were sort of treated by a dad on parental leave, they have more gender-neutral norms and more gender-neutral beliefs. So there is a lot that we can learn about the way in which gender norms can evolve. Now, one final point that I want to make about gender norms. So again, it's very different for public intervention to make a dent in gender norms, especially because it's also very hard to think whether it's right or wrong to intervene on people's sort of intimate beliefs on how they want to spend their family life. But now I'm going to talk about something which is a lot less controversial, which is basically saying, no matter what underlying norms are, let's leave norms exactly how they are, how conservative or how progressive they are. We should really think about what is the perception, the second-order beliefs about these norms. So one reason why norms might remain sticky over time is because of something called pluralistic ignorance. So this is a case in which most people in society, they individually reject some norm. So most of us may individually reject the norm that women should be staying at home looking after babies. But we may wrongly think that all our peers are actually a lot more conservative than that. So we end up behaving very conservatively, not because we like it, but we think that we are afraid of social pressure. So this point is actually interesting because there's lots of evidence of misperception in social norms. So probably the most interesting study is about Saudi Arabia, which is a fairly conservative context. And even in Saudi Arabia, the second-order belief about conservativeness is a lot more conservative than the first-order belief. And this is very important in Saudi Arabia because typically men need to give permission to their wives in order for them to work in the labor market. So when men think it's appropriate, it's extremely important for women's labor market participation. So basically, only 60% of men in Saudi Arabia think that it's wrong for women to work in the labor market. But they think that a much bigger proportion of their peers would look down on them if their wives were working in the labor market. So there is a problem of misperception, and all the policy needs to do in this case is kind of redressing the misperception. Now, I'm going to summarize some of this data about misperceptions. So this is the part that I found a bit surprising in the end. So I'm going to show you evidence on two types of beliefs, two elements. The first one is about women's freedom to work outside the home. So these dots here represent the percentage of the population that in all these countries believe that women have a fundamental right and a fundamental freedom to work outside the home if they want. And this proportion is actually really high. The minimum is here, about 60% in Pakistan, all the way up to 100% nearly in many rich countries, like, for example, the US. And Spain is somewhere here around 90%. So 90% of people in Spain think that it's absolutely perfect for women to work outside the house. The yellow diamonds is the belief among women, and the green squares is the belief among men. You can see that in all rich countries, men and women have exactly the same beliefs. Now, this is the second order belief. So this is what people think about their fellow citizens. So the fact that all these dots are negative, so they go from -10 to -35, means that everywhere in the world, people think that everyone else around them is a lot more conservative than they actually are. So basically, for example, let me take the Spanish example again. Where is that? Somewhere. Anyway, so in Spain, we said 90% of the population is in favor of women's freedom to work outside the home, but people think that only 80% of women, as opposed to 90%, are in favor, and 50% of men are in favor, instead of, again, 90%. So there is a huge underestimate of how sort of gender-neutral people are. And this underestimate is much, much bigger for men than for women. So we tend to believe that everybody is particularly conservative, even when they're not. And in particular, we think that men are super conservative, much more than women. And in reality, instead, they're fairly similar. This is another thing. This is support for affirmative action. So do we believe that is correct to have, in some cases, for example, in the labor market or in education, some affirmative action for underrepresented group? And here, the average goes from 30% in the Czech Republic to 90%, maybe surprisingly in India, because India experimented a lot with affirmative action, especially in politics. And in Spain here is right half-half. So 50% of the population in Spain believe that it's correct to have affirmative action. Again, there is some difference between men and women. Women are a little bit more in favor than men, but not hugely so. So what is the misperception now? Now, the misperception in some cases is negative. In most of these countries is negative, especially for men. So most of these countries have men below 0. So typically, people underestimate men's favor towards affirmative action. And for women, it's probably almost half and half. So in gender conservative countries, here on the left, people tend to underestimate women's support for affirmative action, while in rich countries towards the right, countries in which actually there is quite a bit of affirmative action, for example, in the corporate sector or in politics, people tend to overestimate women's support for affirmative action. So what do we make out of this data? What are the channels by which people tend to underestimate or overestimate the gender conservative of their fellow citizens? So there are two key channels at work here. One is minority overweighting. So there is a certain minority in the population. Typically, it's only a minority that is conservative. Even in very conservative countries, only a minority who thinks that women shouldn't have a right to work outside the household. But typically, there is an overweighting. We believe that that minority is actually a lot larger than it is. And also, there is some stereotyping. So there is some gender differences in behavior, but we tend to overestimate the extent to which men and women are different. And this echoes the results that I was showing you before about gender differences in overconfidence. The data are telling us that actually men and women are very similar, but somehow we believe that they tend to be very different. So this is basically incorporating a gender stereotype in our beliefs. Why is that important? Well, first of all, when people overstate the conservative views among others, among their peers, they may engage into gender conservative behavior wrongly, like against the reality of what people think. So this is against their intrinsic preferences, but it's also against their peer preferences. So they're doing something that is completely wasted. They're behaving conservatively, but this is kind of completely wasted, like it was happening in the example on Saudi Arabia. But you see from the previous diagrams that is happening in most countries in the world. Also, something that is kind of interesting about affirmative action, in more gender equal countries, people think that women are a lot more in favor of affirmative action than they actually are. So perhaps women are not so happy about affirmative action as we believe them to be. This is kind of interesting because in a sense, women is precisely the group that is supposed to benefit from affirmative action. So why is it that women are not so happy about it? Maybe this is really something that we should understand better. Maybe it's because women expect some sort of entrenched stereotypes following affirmative action. Maybe they expect a backlash. This is something that we really don't know at the moment. Okay, so let me just conclude with some key points and a little bit of a research agenda. So I've shown you here that gender is now really a mainstream topic in labor economics. Lots of areas, not just in labor economics, but in economics at large, for example, education, health, and development, are looking at gender differences, not just as an issue of social justice, but also allocative efficiency. So much of the recent work on the remaining disparity, just to summarize this super simply, is centered around the tension between work and family. But why do we have that tension between work and family? A lot of that has to do with constraints that are imposed through the organization of work, which itself stems a little bit from societal norms. So what are the things that we really need to understand better in future research? First of all, the role of firms. I was very quiet about the role of firm in all of this, but of course, firms play a very important role in terms of providing family-friendly amenity, in terms of exercising monopsony power, in terms of propagating or redressing gender norms, etc. So a lot more to be done about firms. This tension between work and family, we tend to think that this is getting better because we have a lot of ways to substitute female work in the household and female work in childcare. But there's also some dissenting voices because, for example, the future of work, the digital revolution, working from home possibilities, do not really seem to hold a solution after all. We don't see any sort of obvious solution to gender gaps coming, for example, from work flexibility or working from home. And also, there is also some evidence about rising parental time demands. So it is true perhaps that women spend less time doing basic childcare, but they spend more or less the same amount of time, if not more time than they used to, in what we call educational childcare. For example, extracurricular activities, taking kids to learn different languages, etc., etc. All of that is actually going up rather than going down. So the key question is, how can we really try to shift gender norms? How we can sort of reballance this kind of burden within the house? So what policies or interventions are effective and why? This whole chat was about the labor market, but we really need to understand what is the role, for example, of families in socializing boys and girls, the education, in breaking or even inducing gender stereotypes, research. For example, I was showing the research results in the area of gender overconfidence. And when we were looking at those papers, when you look at the point estimates in terms of gender differences and standard errors, there wasn't much of a difference there, but perhaps the summary of the paper looked a lot more catchy, a lot more interesting if it said, well, actually it's women who shy away from competition, men who compete a lot. So even the way in which we present research results is important. And also the media is extremely important, traditional media, social media. I'm finishing with a very simple, with a kind of example that comes from a commercial advert. So this is an advert for Aptamil, which is a brand of formula milk. So actually, this is a commodity, formula milk, which is supposed to replace maternal breastfeeding. So this is actually substituting some of the maternal involvement in sort of child rearing. And this is the way in which the advert is portraying the fantastic benefits of this Aptamil. Aptamil is going to make your babies grow into their best version of selves. So for baby boys, they are growing, becoming sort of mathematically oriented, playing with sort of educational toys, and then becoming engineers or mathematicians. So you see this guy with lots of formulas in front of him. And then you have girls who are growing into beautiful ballerinas. So, and this is an advert in the UK. Now, since 2018, these kind of adverts are outlawed. So since 2018, there is a regulation in the UK advertising industry which rules out any advert that sort of stereotypes one gender or another by portraying, for example, one gender unable to do a certain activity because of a stereotype. So you cannot show a man being unable to change a nappy. It's not fun and it's not legal anymore. You cannot portray a woman who is unable to park a car. So this thing is outlawed. So it would be quite interesting to understand what is the consequence of that. This happened in the UK in 2018. The rest of Europe is not there yet. It's talking about regulation, but is nowhere there. Okay, so let me stop here. I will leave this as a holding slide. I'm very happy to take your questions. I have to sit there.
Yeah, Barbara, thank you very much for this very engaging talk. Now we have some time for questions. I have lots of questions, but I was told we should first take questions from the audience, from the public. And the idea is to please be to the point. Okay, we have many people here. Ask your questions to the point so that we can take many questions today. So let's go ahead. So who has questions to Barbara? I think you need to raise your hand. That's the system, right? Start with Caroline.
So maybe I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. But if social norms are so important, and we know that men are not doing enough at home, wouldn't it be time maybe to shame men that are not doing enough so that social norms change and they will start doing more at home and women will be able to maybe focus more on their careers? Maybe a quick example, there are a lot of funny videos online of people randomly interviewing dads in the street and asking very basic questions like, when was your kid born? In which school is he going? What's the name of the teacher? And a lot of these men are completely unable to answer. And then they turn to the moms and they ask the same questions, and of course the men know. They know the name of the best friend, etc., etc. So maybe it's a bit of an intense question, but maybe if there was also more like, shaming of bad dads, as there is a shaming of moms that are never doing enough, maybe if social norms were changing in this direction, do you think we would reach better gender equality?
Yeah, and I think it's a very important point. It's not actually so much the devil's advocate, because some of the stuff I was talking about is really talking about the role of the media, social media, all these kind of videos that we catch online about either breaking or being neutral or redressing stereotypes. So for example, when I was showing you the advert, this is precisely doing that. The advert is supposed to be funny. So actually funny, it's supposed to be making you feel really good. Instead of breastfeeding, you get this milk and you get the best for your baby. But then this is telling you what is the best for your baby. If it's a boy, becoming an engineer. If it's a girl, is becoming a ballerina. So the kind of media that we get is extremely important for that. So this is one point. And then again, with social media, this is super pervasive because there is no limit to the kind of stuff that you can be exposed. Your second point is really about information, is really knowing about the data. And these are the data that I was showing at the very beginning of the presentation when I was showing you gaps in unpaid work. So for example, when I was showing you the data on Spain, the average Spanish man and the average Spanish woman, forget about work in the household or in the market, but every day, there is a difference in the average time spent of leisure of 1 hour. It's a lot, because in any given day, we don't spend that many hours on leisure, so 1 hour extra, it's actually quite a lot. So is this information that you knew, or is it news? I don't know.
Wonderful talk. Just a question about the first graph of your presentation, which was about the STEM. What do you think is the reason why women still shy away from high earnings growth studies?
So thanks for the question. This is really important, Juanjo. So I haven't looked into this myself, but there are a few studies that look at the way in which boys and girls have selected into STEM careers. A bit of that is related to the way in which maths is taught to girls and boys in primary education. I mean, teacher bias does have an impact there. Also, beliefs about what kind of profession, what kind of occupation you do with certain fields. And for example, the stereotypes, so some of the stereotypes may have to do with economics as well. Economics is not STEM, but sometimes we tend to say as economists that there are not enough women in economics. Typically, there's like 1/3 women, 2/3 men in undergraduate economics. And one of the reasons why people say that might be the case is because of this stereotype about economics being about money and finance. And instead, when we talk about economics to kids in schools, there is a lot to learn about social issues, economics intervention to alleviate poverty, to reduce inequality, to improve access to health, to improve access to education. This is also a stereotype, because who says that women wouldn't like to work for something that gives them more money and men wouldn't like to work for something that helps other people? We really need to understand the source of where the stereotypes come from. There is some that comes from families and from schools, but we haven't got to the bottom of the problem yet.
Maybe let me ask one question, and then we take more questions from the audience. So you started your talk by saying that there might be these inherent differences, right? You said there might be inherent differences in skills, there might be inherent difference in preference. And then I think you sort of very convincingly ruled out the skills story by saying that, look, if we look at these different types of skills, there's actually very little between gender difference and a lot of within gender difference. But that discussion was focusing on skills for the labor market. What about skills for childcare, so to say? And I'm thinking a bit back to Claudia's presentation earlier today about paternity reforms. How much do we know about that? Are there skill differences? Are there gender differences in taking care of young children? Do we think sort of, maybe the gender difference is not in terms of the ability to do work in the labor market, but maybe there is a skill difference in terms of childcare?
Yeah, that's the key question, because when I was talking about these female-dominated professions or male-dominated professions, I mean, the most female-dominated occupation of all is taking care of your own children, okay? So, for example, what Claudia was showing this morning is that when paternity leave was introduced in Spain and men were spending more time with their children, actually those children, which is kind of worrying, they had some developmental delays with respect to children that had, for example, exclusive maternal care or maternal care plus formal child care. Well, for example, studies for the labor market, the social care in the UK, in which a lot of the skills might be similar to the skills that you need for home-based childcare, or the education sector in Finland, where again, a lot of the skills might be similar to what you need at home. There you could see that actually opening it more to men selected the good men in that job. So this is probably talking to differences in the kind of men that you attract. So who are the compliers? So who are the compliers in Finnish education? Who are the compliers in the UK social sector? Who are the compliers in the Spanish home sector? So in the cases that I was showing for the labor market, it really seems that the marginal men were better than the women that they were displacing. In the Spanish home sector, it seems that the marginal men were actually worse than the women and the formal childcare that they were displacing. So perhaps instead of thinking about whether genetically men or women are better or worse at doing a certain thing, which is probably hard to figure out, probably we are better as economists trying to study what is the process of selection. How can we induce the best possible compliers following intervention?
Exactly. Very good. More questions from the,
I have a question. I have the microphone here. I have a question about the trade wife here in the front.
Sorry, thank you.
About the trade wife trend coming up. As you were talking about media, in media, I think we all seen the trend coming up about trade wife, younger women staying at home, playing the housewife, or not playing, being the housewife again. Have you seen maybe coming up a difference in the studies, or do you might think that this could change this whole thing? Because I guess this is an important part of media in
Yeah,
that moment.
yeah. And then, so I think what you're saying is really interesting, because I'm not a heavy user of social media, but I think there is this kind of gender gap in the way in which men and women tend to become influencers. So perhaps a lot of female influencers, they really become such by showcasing their sort of maternal role and their babies and how beautiful and photogenic they are, a lot more than men. So I don't know, it's a super interesting question. I mean, what is the impact in terms of gender roles on young girls being exposed to that kind of gender role? Yeah, so this is really anyone's guess. It's super important because we may think of education sort of trying to break gender stereotypes. But then what about if young girls and young boys, they just look at completely kind of gender segregated influentials?
Yes, so my question is related with Jan's question that indeed, I mean, I think that was very illustrating, because indeed we are educated very differently depending on by gender, right? I mean, we might be girls risk adverse in terms of financial investment, in terms of sport lovers or whatever, right? That is might be related with skills, capacities, and also selection in the job market, or even selection in education, right? I mean, so I think it might be important to think about policies even way before thinking about education choices, but as well on how shall we run away from this gender cluster, right? And I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So which kind of policies can we put in place that could dominate could shift the gender, the cultural norms, right? That is really important.
So are you mostly asking, for example, about the education sector? So when kids are really young and what kind of role models they might be exposed? So really interventions that may happen very early in life.
So in that case, it would be trying to escape from the concept that girls, we are risk adverse, so we need to avoid physical activities. So it's trying to break these stereotypes, right? I mean, that is important how fathers or how mothers we think that we are doing properly or not, right? I mean, so
yeah. So when you're saying we girls are risk averse, is that the truth? Is that a perception? Is that a stereotype? Yeah, exactly. So one way to debunk the stereotypes is really to read the research with a sort of deeper eye. Sometimes even the research is summarized by saying women are more risk averse than men, which on average is true, but very little. And the difference between the risk aversion of men and women on average is much smaller than the within gender variation in risk aversion. So let's focus on the within gender variation if we think that risk aversion is very important. And also, if we want to correlate that with labor market outcomes, all this stuff explains very little about labor market outcome. So there is this kind of survey article by Blau and Kahn that shows that maybe less than a fifth can be explained by these traits, looking at this later. So it's basically becoming better acquainted with the research, the biasing the media, the biasing education, and again, is what we learn in families as well.
Yeah. But it's not a biology construct, it's something that we learn.
Exactly. I think there is I'm not a neuroscientist, but I think there is very little evidence that this is about biology, because if you look at lesbian couples, for example, their biology doesn't explain, doesn't drive any permanent gap. Or if you look at adoptive couples.
Yeah. That was my point. Thank you.
I'm going to try to sneak in one more question. Do we have time for?
There is a question in the first row.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hello. I just want to ask, how sticky do you think social norms really are? Like, for example, if women are stepping out to work, over time, eventually, the responsibility of like household work has to be distributed. We're seeing this in India where it's more of a kind of demand side issue where women want to work, but there's not enough people hiring women, so the social norms in turn aren't really changing. So there's some new research on that, so I'm just wondering what you think about that.
No, it's a very important question, especially in India, in which women on average are relatively highly educated relative to other countries at the same level of income, but the participation is extremely slow. And my understanding of the research there is that there is almost this kind of competition between the labor market and the marriage market. Maybe you become kind of relatively highly educated, not necessarily to maximize your labor market returns, but to maximize your marriage market returns. And in particular, even women who are relatively highly educated, if they receive, for example, marriage proposals before they enter into a sort of long-term career, they might marry very young and basically forgo that kind of career. But then there's also been some kind of field experiment that shows what happens if you make good job offers to these women before they accept a marriage proposal, and then they get locked in a very good career, and maybe they marry a little bit later. So in a sense, these kind of norms, they do not seem to be set in stones. I mean, it is true that perhaps the marriage returns of education are very salient in certain communities, but they're not set in stone. I mean, because if these women are sort of qualified for certain careers, if they get an offer in these careers, perhaps they just take it and they delay marriage.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Then I'm going to ask one more question. So, yeah, you talked about skills, you talked about preferences, and I want to ask you about differences in preferences. So the last part of the talk was about norms, but we didn't talk so much about difference in preference itself, which is of course very related to norms. But are there differences in preferences? Would we be fine with there being differences in preferences? Because the discussion moved very fast to there being norms, and I had this feeling that sort of norms seem to have this negative connotation here, right? You could of course just argue that norms are a reflection of preferences, and typically in economics we typically just take preferences as given and maximize condition on those preferences. Yeah. But here we had a devil's advocate saying that, you know, we should change norms, we should shame fathers, we should really change it. Let me play the devil's advocate in the other direction.
Yeah.
It's like, why, you know, typically when we talk about norms, what strikes me in the topic of gender, there's sort of more this urge of saying we need to change the norms. I think you gave some arguments of why that is the case, but could you talk again about
that's a very important point. Yeah, thanks for raising it. So basically, when we think about, so if we think about preferences is something that enters our utility function and we never question them. When we talk about norms, we have to think, where does that come from? Is that an intrinsic preference? And in a sense, in that case, it would be very delicate. It would be very weird for public intervention to try to change your own beliefs on how to raise your children. This is a very intimate sphere of your life. And then there's other cases in which you have more like social pressure for something that you don't particularly care about all that much. So you think, for example, that it's totally fine for women to work in the market, but you ask your wife not to work in the market because then your neighbors are going to look down on you. So these are two very different cases. In the second case, when there is some misperception, then we can only gain from addressing this kind of misperception because it's basically just giving people the correct information. So this is simple. Now, when we think about intrinsic preferences, then of course things are very, very different because it's a very delicate thing. I mean, even there, if I can make some sort of extreme example. So for example, we say it's very hard for the government to impose on people how to sort of raise their kids. But for example, some governments impose on women to take at least 2 or 6 weeks, or I don't know how many weeks, out of the labor market when they have children. And this is an imposition, okay? And then why not have the same rule for men as there is in Spain, for example? So in a sense, it's not that the government is shying away from imposing rules in very intimate areas of your life.
They're already doing it.
It's already doing it, so perhaps there is nothing kind of crazy about it. Or even if we think that it's crazy, in any case, why should it not be gender neutral?
More questions, comments?
There is this person here in the third row.
Thank you. So one of the things, and taking what Juanjo was saying and your response, for me, super interested that your choosing, how you choose your career is influenced by your teachers, and most of the teachers are female. So that for me is very interesting because that reflects some very deep ideas of the teachers itself. And maybe this is changing, using the result that you say that people now in Spain that they are growth with a parent that take care of you or whatever, then they are going to be the new teachers, let's say. So we can influence them to try to not to do that. But I was thinking in the other side of the decision, when you decide what career you are going to choose, you having to account if you are able to do it. Your skills, because you're saying, no, girls are bad in math or whatever. But then you also think, I'm going to get hired. And I think that's super important because you have this idea of mothers or women are not going to be hired because they are going to be mothers, for example, and you have that, and it's going to be more difficult for me. And I also read, and I have to be honest, on social media, this idea or this survey of firms or people going to like human resources even, saying that, okay, I believe a woman can do this exactly as a man, but then I think that my public is going to, my customers, thank you, are going to be looking for a man on sales, on, you know, security, on certain things, or even as a school teacher of my child, I'm looking for a pretty nice little lady to take care of my child and not a man. So I think that that's also part of the input that you have in mind when you are designing a career. So what do you think that we can do with that part?
Yeah, this is very important. This is like anticipation effects of the kind of differential opportunities that you expect in the labor market, and you start making decisions when you are 15, taking into account what you're going to experience maybe 20 years later in the labor market. So about education and occupational choice, again, two things. One thing is that it is shown that teachers' behavior and teacher bias does have an impact on what people decide to do, whether they go to specialize in maths or humanities. But also is that, for example, role models may help to break that bias. So for example, if kids, when they are 11-year-old, are shown about role models like of women specializing in physics and engineering, this is an experiment that was actually done in French public schools, this does have an impact. Now, the other issue is about like the anticipation effect. You can say, well, maybe I'm going to be really good as a physicist. And even that is a constraint, because even men and women with exactly the same grades in physics or maths, they're less likely to take physics and maths. So even there is a gap. So even conditional on ability. But then even conditional on ability, conditional on taking a certain degree, if you expect some sort of lower opportunities in the labor market, you may underinvest in something that you're good at doing. And this is where I like to go back to the role models idea, because the role models are very effective, not just in education, but also for the labor market. So for example, this experiment that was done in French schools was done by women who were working in a large multinational company, and they were mostly women in sort of research and development. So basically these women were like scientists, and they were working in R&D. And doing this kind of presentations to secondary school students, it did have an impact on the interest of these people in that sort of career. So in a sense, role models are important, not just in education, but also for occupational choice.
Jennifer, yeah. Wait, we also have some people online. I think they want to hear you. Yeah.
So when you were talking about the misperceptions, one of the puzzles that you posed was why, with affirmative action, why women in particularly kind of gender equal societies were against it when it's probably women who are the beneficiaries of this. And one of the things that I was thinking about is in places where there's a lot of inequality, there's a lot of gains to be made from kind of correcting some of that inequality through the affirmative action. But one of the things that it made me think of in places that have already a lot more equality is that why might some of those women who are already high achieving and seeing some of this equality be against rules that promote women in the labor market? They might worry that then people won't think that they earned it, that they got it because of a quota or they got it because of the law. So, and it just reminded me of a lot of the affirmative action literature on by race in the US, that there was a lot of discussion about kind of, for say higher educated, high achieving black men, they were against some of the affirmative action because everybody just thought they got the job because of a quota. And so you pose that as a puzzle that we don't really know why would they be against it. Well, maybe because of these stereotypes and these ideas, they might worry that, already have a certain amount of success. I don't want people to think that it's just because of this quota, when we know that it works, those sort of policies do work quite well at removing barriers when there's a lot of inequality. So I just wanted to throw that out there and see what you thought.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. And I'm inclined to think exactly as you say, that this is perhaps the leading reason why the minority might be less in favor of affirmative action than the sort of general survey respondents thinks. Because in a way, you want to make sure that whatever the achievements are, they are not sort of assigned to the fact that there was affirmative action. So this basically would be like entrenching stereotypes. So there is a lot to say about affirmative action, which in principle it can go wrong. It can actually entrench stereotypes, because if you have limited supply of women with a CEO experience, simply because it's a male-dominated profession, of course you have very few women who might be qualified to do the job, so it's almost tautological. So this may entrench stereotypes. There's actually some people who might go further and say, well, even if maybe this person wouldn't have achieved the same position without the gender quota, maybe she or he can have beneficial role models in changing the sort of public attitudes. So by being exposed to more female politicians, maybe we tend to believe that women can be female leaders as much as men can be male leaders. So I really don't know the evidence on that, but then I think that I completely agree with you that this is the main worry about entrenching stereotypes. But there's also some kind of different views that say, okay, even if we entrench the stereotype, maybe somebody's going to be taught the right way.
I think this was a nice way of finishing.
Okay.
We're running out of time. I'm sure there are many more questions, but maybe you can talk to Barbara in person. So thank you very much for
Thank you so much.
super engaging talk and for all the questions. Yeah.
Thank you.